Where along this journey did you first get inspired to write Final Target, which became your first published novel? Was it based on a real case you were working on? And by extension, was Graham Gage based it all on your work in the field? Was kind of an amalgam of sources or any one in particular person that inspired him?
I had thought about writing many years ago. And in fact, I wrote a whole nonfiction book of cases that I was really outraged by. Innocent people that were prosecuted, prosecutorial misconduct, planted drugs, witnesses who were willing to let innocent people go to jail, just stuff that I was really outraged by. So I started writing this stuff out. And then I realized, well, you got to change the names because you climb confidence you can. And then so people don't recognize the cases, you got to change sort of the facts of the cases. And then some of the victims, witnesses went through really horrible experiences. He said, well, I really don't have the right to make these people relive these experiences. So I let it go for 10 years. And then one morning I'm in the office early for a conference call between a couple of time zones. Call's over, 6 o'clock, thinking, maybe I should think about writing fiction. I hadn't read it for a long time. I read Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and people like that when I was in graduate school, sort of end of the year or end of the semester, sort of escape. I think I may have read a Joseph Wambaugh book. I mean, impressive, astounding writer, one of the early ones. So, well, maybe I'll write one of these. So I drafted out two outlines. One of them became, Final Target. And I started writing it. I get to the office about 6 in the morning, write for a couple hours, and then so the staff showed up, and then the workday. So I did that. Took a couple of years to finish because I couldn't write when I was on the road. So I get this thing done, and it ends up to be not a thriller, but more of a travelogue with some interesting scenes. And I couldn't figure out, what happened. So I started reading. First of all, the Gage character. So Ross McDonald, who I think is by far the best private investigator writer of all time, people asked him about his character, was that you? And his line was, I'm not Archer, his character, but Archer is me. And that his character takes his own values, his own view of the world out into that real world, out into that fictional world. And that's Gage. And I wanted a name that kind of reflected that. The name just sounded right for him. Gage, I knew a guy in college, last name was Gage. He was really smart, insightful, very courageous guy. He got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Back then, treatment wasn't good, and he died. And I liked that Gage. He had a solid feel. And then originally his name was going to be Seth Gage.
Wow.
A friend of mine named Seth Norman, who's really a brilliant outdoor fishing writer. And it didn't sound right. And then I came across the name Graham, and so that's how I got his name. So then I end up with, basically, textbook, scene, travelogue, history, but not a thriller. So I started reading some of these things, and from Michael Connelly, who I think is just brilliant.
You're the best.
I learned a couple of really important, a lot of things. But I took one of his books, I think it was called City of Bones, and I just studied it like a textbook. So what I discovered is that in real life, real life investigation is just so different than fictional investigation. Real life investigators, if they're good at it, are professionals. So they plan before they do anything and they execute it. If they didn't execute it almost every time, nobody's going to pay them. They lower tension wherever they go. They don't raise tension unless there's some very strategic reason to do it. I have never gotten a serious confession from somebody, whether it's in a homicide or in smuggling or in some fraud, by leaning on them. Just, you want to create an environment for wherever their psychology is, you can allow them to get the story out. What you notice in the first 48 is that, particularly in the original years, I haven't seen it for a number of years, all of the tension in their shows comes from music, from jump cuts, from pictures of the clock. The good homicide detectives are just so low key.
And you're saying it's the same with like a private investigator.
The same with a private investigator. You want to lower tension. In terms of obstacles, readers want to see a tenacity of pounding in obstacles, pounding and then pounding. Well, no. Investigators, competent investigators in the United States, I don't know what they are now, $300 an hour, $400 an hour. No client wants to spend $400 an hour for a guy beating his head against a wall. Readers want the challenge, the attempt to fail, they want rising tension, they want all this stuff.
So how did you find the balance between those two worlds with Graham?
Well, a couple of things. First, I discovered that I was ending chapters, as I would in sort of real life, with my plan. And I tell the reader what my plan was, and then I go do it. So for Final Target, all I had to do was go through and lop off the end of a bunch of chapters, and I had suspense. And then the other thing I noticed, and this is where I think Connolly is just brilliant, is and this is where a lot of new writers fail. They don't really see their scene. They see part of it, but they don't see deeply enough into it. Connolly sees into it, and he's able to see the potentiality for tension and conflict, where he has, two people talking, and there's the potential for conflict and tension there, and he has a dog come into the room. And the readers that feels the tension of what's this dog going to do, protective, whatever else. So if you can see your scene well, you can let the tension rise. It doesn't have to be really explicit. So in learning those kinds of things, I was able to turn this into a book that I thought somebody might read. And I had a lot of help. My wife is a brilliant reader. I mean, her questions really guided me to getting things on the page. Young writers think something's on the page. It's not there. It's still in their head. They didn't get it there. She could see that, and she did that through all these books. I had lawyers to read these things, so I thought, who were also good readers. I sent it to a lawyer who had a couple of published books. And lawyers, for reasons maybe we can talk about, are particularly good at crime fiction and dialogue. And he said, good, this is going to get published, I have no doubt. But one thing you should do is, there's this mystery writers conference over in Marin County every year. There's 200 or 300 attendees. There's a lot of really good people presenting. He said, we worked together on some things. He said, you better go over there and get a feeling for what this world is like. So I signed up and paid my, $300 or $400, whatever it was for or maybe it was $250, something like that, for a 4-day event. Really well put on, excellent speakers, presenters. And at one of the lunches, I happened to sit at our table. At the other end was a marketing executive from HarperCollins. And so I asked him, well, do you think there's a market for these kind of international financial thrillers that I want to write? And he said he thought there still was. And so then a couple of weeks later, I wrote him an email. I gave him my background, gave him the prologue, a list of the cases I'd worked on. And he wrote back and said, "Hey, I think this is a good start. How about let me edit the book? And if I think it's good enough, I'll take it to the publisher." And so that was it. So that's how Graham Gage got it. But for that to happen to a young writer is, particularly a young writer. I mean, in crime fiction, in a lot of fiction, and also nonfiction, they want the writer to have a platform. Well, I had the door open because I sent him a list of the cases I worked on. So I had instant credibility there. Turned out the prologue was pretty good. If I was a young writer, I wouldn't even gotten him to the prologue. Well, same thing with literary agents. It is really hard for a young writer to get a literary agent. Literary agents are the gatekeepers. They're just the gatekeepers. And let's be blunt too. It's like every other profession. You have the top 10% that are just wonderful at what they do, great with clients, great with publishers, sell lots of books. They just really know it. And then there's another 30% that are pretty good, and then there's the rest that aren't up to it. That's just the way the world works. It's that way in real estate and insurance and in high tech and everything. And lawyers, private investigators, that's just the way it is.
What about dealing with editors early on in your career?
Well, the writer has to know what you're doing, why you're doing it. The editor, you want an editor that reads like an editor, who reads from the perspective of your audience, not their own perspective, from the perspective of who's going to read this book. What they can divine being on the page may not be there for a read, particularly if you got, like I've got, these are 2 series, 1 4, the other 3. The editor is thinking from the perspective of the reader who hasn't read the last book or the one before that, who's maybe, there's a classic line in writing, it's the second book that sells the first. Well, so you got to treat the second book as also as an introduction to the character. So you always have to find, and that's, I hate to keep coming back to Connolly, but he does that with his Bosch character. It's astounding how he's able to tell, or was able to tell, the same story of Bosch's Vietnam experience, book after book after book, and it all seemed fresh, slightly different. Something new was abstracted out of that experience. So you need a reader that gets that, a reader who has an ear for dialogue, a reader who understands the metaphors you're using. So when they make a suggestion, that it's consistent with your metaphors or consistent with the theme of the book and doesn't violate it.
Once it became clear there was demand for more, did you have absolute risk already in your back pocket heading into that Graham Gage sequel?
Well, first of all, I had written Absolute Risk before Final Target. Well, new writers don't realize that you better be ready to submit the next book.
Yep.
When your first book is published. And I wanted that book to be ready. I don't like writing under pressure. After the Gage book was published, they immediately asked, it was the original contract with 3 books, they immediately asked me to write another 4 more. So there was a lot of pressure. Well, go back to your question. Sorry.
No, please.
I didn't really, my first reaction to getting the book published was just relief. This is over with, it's done. It's like when you finish a case and it comes out well. It's just a relief, particularly, it's just a relief. And when the thing got published, it was a relief. Later, Liz, that's my wife, and I went to the bookstore. And when the day came out, she said, come on, let's go look. So you go down to, I go down to the bookstore, and there's a whole bunch of these things. And HarperCollins, of course, is a great publisher. So when they send a book out, and they send lots of them out, and they spend the extra money to get it up in front of the store. And so you walk in, and there's your book right there.
That must have been amazing. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's your book is sitting there. Richard North Patterson is sitting there, and Lisa Scottolini is sitting there, and you're out of your league. That you're not. You don't kid yourself. And there it is. So you get some satisfaction out of that. And also, all these books have a point. I don't write for fun. I write stories that arise out of things that outrage me in the world, whether it's drug smugglers or Swiss bankers or these chartered accountants in London. It's people, particularly these white collar folks, that how does it? You got billions and billions of dollars stolen from Russia, Ukraine, places like that, laundered by these people into New York real estate. Everybody knows it's been going on since before the fall of the Soviet Union. And you look at these guys, and it's almost all men. And you look at these guys, and you realize the damage they did in Ukraine. The first 10 years of independence, life expectancy dropped 10 years. Think of that. $100 billion came out of Ukraine in the first few years. I went to some hospitals because it just happened there were just gazillion people I needed to interview, and among them were people in the hospital. It's awful. There's a scene in White Ghost that takes place at a hospital, and I describe people walking by, family members walking by. They're carrying towels and sheets and food and medical supplies. It's up to the families to somehow scrounge up this stuff and bring it to the hospital because it's not supplied at the hospital by the hospital itself. Well, this is the damage those folks did. In addition to the murders that took place, the organized crime, all this stuff. So I write angry. That's, my sense of realism in fiction is trying, in the course of telling a good story, to let readers experience not only all those emotions and tensions, but to experience that world. So going back to, my graduate school days, but I was interested in that social ontology. The social constructions of banks and corporations and organized crime and all this stuff. I want readers to experience that in a realistic way. So I only write things that I have some knowledge of, pretty deep knowledge of, because I've experienced it myself. And I want anybody who reads a book like Final Target or Powerblind, they can figure out in a heartbeat how money gets laundered in the United States, how Russian money gets laundered in the United States. They understand how, say, like in Russia, I had a client in Russia who was an oligarch close to Putin. And realized in working on that, it was a compromise case where right after Putin got elected, there was basically a war of the oligarchs. People trying to take Putin out by taking out his financial backers, this kind of stuff. So basically what you learn in talking to people in that world, that you see this guy, well, he's the aluminum king of Russia, or he's the steel king or the coal king. They only own this stuff basically as kind of proxies for Putin. when he wants to take it away, he's going to take it away. I mean, it's just, Putin is protected not just by his state security, he's protected by organized crime, because there's so much that happens that state security people won't do, that he's got to rely on organized crime to do it. These people he has killed, journalists and whatever, a lot of those are done by organized crime. Some people come up through that world, some who go from state security into organized crime. That's the kind of, so I want readers to experience that. I want them to be angered by it.